Sandra, please don't do this. We can get through this together. I know things are hard now, but I promise they will get better.
David, I've waited long enough. Love doesn't pay bills. Love doesn't feed a family. I am tired of suffering.
Please, Sandra, don't leave me.
Goodbye, David. I choose a better life.
Sandra, please.
Sandra left her husband because he was poor. She believed money could give her happiness, respect, and the life she always dreamed of. But years later, standing outside a beautiful wedding hall, she learned a painful lesson. Sometimes the treasure you are searching for is the very thing you left behind. Sandra was the kind of woman who made people stop and stare. Not because of her clothes. Not because of her jewelry. But because of the way she smiled. It was the kind of smile that could make a sad man forget his troubles for a moment. She had deep brown eyes, a gentle voice, and a heart that used to be as warm as fresh bread from the oven. People in the neighborhood called her the Sunshine Wife, because whenever she walked out of a small apartment in the morning, she greeted everyone, the old men sitting outside, the children running to school, the women selling vegetables by the roadside. She always had a kind word for everybody. But on this particular Tuesday morning, Sandra did not smile. She sat on the edge of her bed, staring at a pile of unpaid bills on the table, and for the first time in her marriage, she wondered if love was truly enough to survive this world. Her husband David was already awake. He had been awake since 5 in the morning, ironing his only good shirt, the one with the small tear near the collar that he had carefully sewn himself. He was preparing to go out again, to knock on doors, to submit applications, to beg the world to give him a chance. David was not an ordinary man. He had graduated from university with first-class honors. His professors had called him brilliant. His classmates had called him the one who would go far. But the world outside the university gates did not care about grades. The world outside wanted connections, wanted money, wanted people who already knew the right people. And David had none of those things. So every morning, he pressed his shirt, polished his shoes until they shone like mirrors, and went out with his head high and his heart hopeful, even though deep inside, the rejection was slowly eating him alive. David, Sandra called from the bedroom. Her voice was quiet, tired. The landlord sent another message. He said if we don't pay by Friday, he will lock us out. David appeared at the doorway. He looked at her for a long moment without speaking. Then he walked to where she sat, knelt down in front of her like a man praying, and took her hands in his. His hands were raw from the odd jobs he did, carrying goods at the market, fixing things for neighbors, doing anything that could bring in a little money. But his eyes were soft. Sandra, he said slowly, I promise you, this will not be our story forever. I am trying. Every single day, I am trying. Sandra looked at him. She looked at the sincerity in his face, the love in his tired eyes, and for a moment, just a moment, she believed him. She nodded. She even managed a small smile. But somewhere deep inside her, a tiny crack had appeared. And cracks, when ignored, have a way of growing. That same evening, Vivian arrived. Vivian was Sandra's childhood friend, and she always arrived like a storm, loud, colorful, and impossible to ignore. She stepped out of a taxi wearing a dress that probably cost more than David earned in 2 months. Her handbag was branded. Her shoes clicked against the floor like a declaration. She hugged Sandra and immediately began talking about her weekend in a luxury hotel, about the man who had bought her a new phone, about the dinner she had attended where the plates alone looked more expensive than the apartment. Sandra listened quietly. She laughed in the right places and nodded at the right moments. But when Vivian finally left that night and Sandra lay in the dark beside her sleeping husband, she stared at the ceiling for a very long time. The crack inside her grew just a little bit wider. Before we begin this emotional story, take a moment to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Every week, we bring you powerful stories about love, betrayal, life lessons, and second chances. Now let's see what happened when Sandra left her poor husband for a rich man, not knowing that destiny had other plans. Vivian had a way of making poverty feel like a personal failure. She never said it directly. She was too clever for that. Instead, she would say things like, "Sandra, you are too beautiful to be struggling like this," or "A woman like you deserves to be taken care of properly." She said these words gently, sweetly, like someone offering medicine. But the medicine was actually poison, slow, tasteful, and invisible until it was already deep inside you. Sandra had been resisting Vivian's influence for years. Every time Vivian suggested that she should look for a better option, Sandra would laugh it off and say, "Vivian, my husband is a good man. Good things take time." And she meant it. She truly did. But as the months passed and the struggles grew heavier, the words Vivian planted in Sandra's mind began sprouting roots. One afternoon, after a particularly bad week, the shop had made almost no profit. David had come home empty-handed after another day of failed job applications, and they had eaten plain rice with no stew for 3 nights in a row. Vivian showed up and said, "Come. Let me take you somewhere. Just to breathe." Sandra hesitated. David was not home. She told herself she would only be gone for 2 hours. She put on a dress, borrowed Vivian's spare perfume, and stepped into the taxi. 2 hours became 5. Vivian took her to a restaurant where the menu had no prices listed, because the people who ate there did not need to ask about prices. The table had fresh flowers on it. The waiters were better clothes than anything Sandra owned. The food arrived in small, beautiful portions that tasted like something from another world. Sandra sat very still and very quiet, taking everything in. She felt something shift inside her. Something she could not name. Something dangerous. After the restaurant, Vivian took her to a rooftop gathering. Music played softly. People in expensive clothes stood in small groups, laughing easily, holding glasses of things that sparkled. Sandra stood near the edge of the rooftop and looked out at the city lights below. Everything looked beautiful from up here. Everything looked possible. A woman nearby was on the phone saying, "Tell him I only fly business class." Another man was casually mentioning a property he had just purchased in another country. Sandra was not jealous exactly. It was something worse than jealousy. It was hunger. The kind of hunger that does not live in your stomach. It lives in your mind. And once it starts, it is almost impossible to stop. When the taxi dropped her home that night, she walked into her small apartment and looked at the peeling paint on the wall, the second-hand furniture, the single fan that made noise all night, and something inside her quietly broke. She did not say anything to David. She cooked dinner, sat across from him, listened to him talk about a new application he had sent, and smiled at the right moments. But she was no longer fully present. Part of her was still on that rooftop, looking at those lights, imagining a version of her life that looked nothing like the one she was living. David noticed. He was perceptive like that. He reached across the table that night and touched her hand. "Are you okay?" he asked. "You seem far away." Sandra looked at him, at his honest face, his gentle eyes, his rough hands, and said, "I'm fine. Just tired." It was the first time she had lied to him. And it would not be the last. Michael did not look like a man who would destroy a marriage. He looked like someone's successful uncle. He was tall, well-dressed, and had the kind of confidence that made rooms feel smaller when he entered them. He first appeared at Sandra's small shop on a Wednesday morning. He was looking for a particular item, he said. He browsed slowly, asked questions politely, and when he was ready to pay, he handed Sandra a note much larger than the total and waved away the change. "Keep it," he said, smiling easily. "Consider it support for a hardworking businesswoman." Sandra was surprised. People did not talk like that in her neighborhood. She thanked him. He left. She thought nothing more of it. He came back the next day. And the day after that. Each time, he bought small things he probably did not need. Each time, he left more money than necessary. Each time, he said something that made Sandra stand a little straighter, feel a little more seen. "You have real talent for this business," he told her one afternoon. "With the right support, this shop could be something big." He was not aggressive or disrespectful. He did not rush. He was patient and careful, like a man who understood that the most valuable things require time. By the end of the second week, Sandra knew his name. By the end of the third week, she found herself looking toward the door at the time he usually arrived. That realization frightened her, but not enough to make her stop. When Michael finally invited her to dinner, Sandra told herself it was just a meal between acquaintances. She told herself she was allowed to have friends. She did not tell David about the dinner. She told him she was going out with Vivian. The restaurant Michael chose was even more beautiful than the one Vivian had taken her to. He ordered for her with confidence, asked about her dreams, her ambitions, her life. He listened, truly listened, in a way that Sandra felt David had stopped doing, though if she were honest, David's silence came from exhaustion, not indifference. Michael made her laugh. He made her feel like the most interesting woman in the room. When he dropped her home that night, he did not ask for anything. He simply said, "I enjoy your company, Sandra. I hope we can do this again." She stood outside her apartment door for a full minute before going inside, her heart doing something complicated and wrong. The dinners continued. The gifts began: a phone, perfume, a dress. Sandra hid them at first. She told David they were from a customer who paid in kind for goods. She hated herself for lying. But not enough to stop. Michael began telling her things, that she was too bright for her current situation, that she deserved more, that he could give her a life she had only dreamed about. And the worst part was not that she was listening. The worst part was that she was beginning to believe him. Meanwhile, at home, the arguments with David increased. The financial pressure was crushing them both. One evening, after a particularly bad fight about money, David said something he would later regret: "Maybe I am not enough for you, Sandra. Maybe I never was." He said it in pain, not in truth. But Sandra heard it differently. She stored those words in a dark corner of her heart, and later, she would use them to justify what she was about to do. The day Sandra decided to leave began like an ordinary day. She woke up, made tea, sat at the table while David slept because he had worked a night shift carrying goods at a warehouse, a job he had taken without telling her because he was ashamed. She saw his tired body on the bed, his worn shoes near the door, and felt a wave of something: love, guilt, pity, all mixed together so painfully that she had to stand up and move away. She went to the shop. Michael arrived at noon. He did not buy anything. He sat down across from her and said, very calmly, "Sandra, I want you to come and be with me. I have a place ready for you. A life ready for you. You don't have to struggle anymore." Sandra did not speak for a long time. The shop was quiet. A fly buzzed near the window. Outside, the neighborhood moved on, children played, someone's radio played an old song, a woman called out to her neighbor. All of it ordinary. All of it completely unaware that a life was being broken in a small shop on a Wednesday afternoon. "What about David?" Sandra asked. Michael looked at her steadily. "David is a good man," he said. And then he paused. "But a good man cannot give you the life you deserve." It was the cruelest thing anyone could say about someone, to acknowledge their goodness and then use it as a reason to leave them behind. Sandra knew it was cruel. She felt it. But the hunger she had been carrying for months, the hunger for comfort, for ease, for a life without worry, was louder at that moment than her conscience. She looked down at her hands. She thought about the unpaid rent. She thought about the rooftop and the city lights. She thought about eating plain rice. She thought about the dress Michael had bought her that she had never worn because she had no place to wear it in her current life. And she made her choice. She went home that evening and packed a bag while David was still at the warehouse. She moved quickly, not because she was certain, but because she knew if she slowed down, she would change her mind. She picked up a photograph of herself and David on their wedding day. They were laughing in it, genuinely, the kind of laughter that comes from deep happiness. She held it for a long time. Then she put it face down on the table and walked out the door. She left a letter, 3 lines, which was somehow worse than leaving nothing at all. It said, "David, I am sorry. I cannot do this anymore. Please don't look for me. Move on with your life." 3 lines for a man who had given her years of loyalty. 3 lines for a man who had knelt at her feet during their hardest days and promised her it would get better. She closed the door behind her and stepped into Michael's waiting car, and the neighborhood street looked exactly the same as it always did, completely indifferent to the fact that something irreversible had just happened. David came home to silence. He called her name. Nothing. He walked into the bedroom, saw the empty spaces where her things had been, and found the letter on the table. He read it once. Then he sat down on the bed and did not move for a very long time. No tears came at first. Just a terrible stillness. The kind of stillness that comes when pain is too large to fit inside the normal containers. No sobbing, no shouting, just a man sitting absolutely still in an empty apartment while the fan hummed overhead and the world outside went on without him. When the tears finally came, they came quietly, the way they always do for men who have been taught not to show weakness. He cried alone. And then, because he had always been a man of discipline, he wiped his face, folded the letter, placed it carefully in a drawer, and whispered to himself, "Okay. Okay. Get up, David. Get up." Sandra's new life was beautiful. Terrifyingly beautiful. Michael's apartment was on the 10th floor of a building with a uniformed security guard at the gate. There was a dishwasher in the kitchen. Sandra had never used one before. There were 2 bathrooms, both with hot water that actually worked. There was a television as wide as a wall and a wardrobe full of clothes in her size, already chosen and purchased before she even arrived, which should have unsettled her but which at the time felt like magic. For the first 2 weeks, Sandra felt like a woman in a dream. She wore the new clothes. She went to restaurants. She attended events on Michael's arm and smiled for photographs and told herself that she had finally arrived at the life she was always meant to live. She called Vivian constantly during those first weeks, and Vivian celebrated with her enthusiastically. "You see," Vivian said. "This is what you deserved all along." Sandra laughed and agreed. But sometimes, late at night when Michael was asleep beside her, she would lie awake and think about strange things, the sound of David singing quietly while he cooked, his particular way of praying in the morning, his habit of leaving small notes for her around the apartment with encouraging words when he noticed she was sad. She pushed those memories away quickly whenever they appeared. She told herself they belonged to another chapter. She told herself the past was the past. But the dream began showing its seams within 3 months. Michael, she discovered, had a temper. Not violent, not at first, but cold and cutting. When Sandra said something he considered foolish, he would look at her with a particular expression, a slight narrowing of the eyes, a small smile that was not really a smile, and say nothing. The silence was somehow worse than words. He began giving her instructions disguised as suggestions. "You shouldn't wear that. You don't need to call that friend. Why are you asking so many questions?" He monitored her phone. He decided which events she attended and which she stayed home from. The wardrobe full of clothes, she slowly understood, was not a gift. It was a uniform. He had dressed her the way he wanted her to look because he wanted her to be a particular kind of woman, a decorative one, not a thinking one. Sandra stopped calling Vivian as much because Michael did not like it. She stopped going out on her own because Michael preferred to know her exact location at all times. She stopped expressing opinions because it was easier than enduring his cold silence. And as the weeks turned into months, the apartment that had once felt like a dream began feeling like something else entirely. The dishwasher was still there. The hot water still worked. The television was still enormous. But Sandra found herself sitting in the middle of all that luxury, feeling a loneliness so deep it had a physical weight. She thought about something David had once said to her, back when they were very poor, and she had asked him why he was still happy. He had smiled at her and said, "Because I have you, Sandra. That's not nothing. That's everything." She had rolled her eyes then. Now, sitting alone in Michael's beautiful apartment on a Saturday afternoon while he was at a meeting she was not invited to, those words returned to her like a song she had forgotten and suddenly could not stop hearing. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to subscribe and leave a like. And tell us in the comments, do you think Sandra is making a terrible mistake, or do you understand why she feels tempted by a better life? We'd love to hear your thoughts. While Sandra sat in her golden cage, David was quietly becoming a storm. After the night he found the empty apartment and the 3-line letter, he allowed himself exactly 1 week of grief. He missed work. He stopped eating properly. He sat in the dark some evenings and had conversations with a wife who was no longer there. The neighbors noticed and came to check on him. Old Mrs. Peters from next door brought him food 3 evenings in a row without being asked, setting it quietly at his door and knocking twice before leaving. David ate what she brought and told himself that kindness existed in the world and that he had not yet run out of reasons to keep going. After the 1 week was done, he made himself a promise. He wrote it on a piece of paper and stuck it to the wall where he could see it from his bed. It said, "She did not break you. She showed you what you are made of. Now show the world." The opportunity arrived in the most unexpected form. A phone call from a number he did not recognize, on an idle Thursday afternoon 3 months after Sandra left. The voice on the other end said, "Is this David?" David from Greenfield University, class of 2015. David confirmed. The voice said, "This is Emmanuel. I don't know if you remember me. I was the student who used to sit at the back of Professor Ed's class. I was the one who nearly failed out in 2nd year. You used to share your notes with me. You used to bring me food from the cafeteria when I couldn't afford to buy lunch. You never asked for anything in return. You probably forgot about me the moment I graduated." David was quiet. He remembered Emmanuel vaguely, a quiet, serious boy who had always looked slightly overwhelmed by everything. "I remember you," David said. "How are you, Emmanuel?" There was a brief silence on the line. Then Emmanuel said, "David, I am doing well. Very well. And I have been looking for you for 2 years. I need you to come in for a meeting." Emmanuel had built a logistics and technology company from nothing over 6 years. It was now one of the fastest growing companies in the region. He had a reputation for hiring people with strong character over people with strong connections because, as he often told interviewers, "I was helped by a man who had nothing to gain from helping me. That taught me everything I need to know about the kind of people worth investing in." He offered David a role in operations management. The salary was more than David had ever earned. But what moved David was not the salary. What moved him was the end of the meeting, when Emmanuel said simply, "I never forgot what you did for me, David." Not once. David drove home that evening and sat in his car outside his apartment for 15 minutes, not crying exactly, but not quite dry-eyed either, just sitting with the strange feeling of a man who has been walking uphill for a very long time and has suddenly, unexpectedly, caught a glimpse of the top. He threw himself into the walk with everything he had. His intelligence, the same intelligence that had earned him a first-class degree, finally had a stage. His diligence made colleagues notice him within weeks. Emmanuel gave him increasing responsibility because every task David was given came back completed beyond expectation. Within 8 months, David had received 2 promotions. Within a year, he was heading an entire division. He moved into a better apartment. He bought a car, a modest one, because David was never the kind of man who needed to show off. He began investing what he saved. He began building. And he did all of it quietly, steadily, the way he had always done everything, without fanfare, without bitterness, and without ever wasting a single morning feeling sorry for himself. Addis walked into David's life the way morning walks in, gradually, then all at once, until you cannot imagine the world without it. She was Emmanuel's senior financial advisor, a woman who had earned her position through years of disciplined work rather than family influence, despite coming from a wealthy background. She was elegant without being cold, confident without being arrogant, and had the rare quality of making every person she spoke to feel genuinely heard. She had no interest in performance or pretense. She wore simple clothes to the office. She drove herself to work. She always remembered the names of the security guards and the cleaners. David noticed these things about her before he noticed anything else. He noticed the way she treated people when nobody important was watching. That, he had learned from experience, was the truest test of a person's character. They became friends slowly, the way people do when they are both a little bit careful. They had long conversations over office lunches about books, about business strategy, about philosophy, about the strange ways life surprised people. Addis had heard fragments of David's story from Emmanuel and had filled in the rest with her own instincts. She saw a man who had been through fire and come out of it not angry, not bitter, not hardened, but somehow softer, more compassionate, more certain of what truly mattered. She found that extraordinary. Because she had met many men who had suffered and emerged from suffering as smaller versions of themselves. David had emerged larger. One afternoon, after a long meeting, she said to him, "You don't talk about your past much." David looked at her. "The past is not where I live anymore," he said. She nodded slowly, as if he had answered a question she had not quite asked aloud. Their friendship deepened. Lunch conversations became evening conversations. She invited him to a family dinner where her father, a stern man who had built his own fortune from nothing, spent 30 minutes interrogating David about his career and his plans. David answered every question directly, without exaggeration, without false modesty. Adi's father said very little during dinner. But afterward, he put David aside at the door and said quietly, "I have watched many young men in my time. Most of them tell me who they want to be. You told me who you are. Come back." David drove home that night smiling in a way he had almost forgotten was possible. Not the polite smile he wore at work. The real one, the one that reached his eyes and came from somewhere deep and genuine. When David finally told Adis that his feelings for her had grown beyond friendship, he was sitting on a bench in a small park near the office on a Sunday afternoon. He did not have an elaborate plan. He had no ring, no restaurant, no performance. He simply looked at her and said, "Adis, I want to be honest with you because I have learned that honesty is the only foundation that holds. I think I am falling in love with you. I don't want to pretend otherwise." She was quiet for a moment. A child ran past them chasing a ball. Somewhere, a bird made a sound. Then Adis turned to look at him fully and said, "David, I have been waiting for you to say that since the third time we had lunch together." He laughed, loud and real. She laughed too. And sitting in that ordinary park on that ordinary Sunday, something extraordinary and new and permanent began. Michael's mask did not fall off all at once. It dissolved, piece by piece, like sugar left in rain. First came the discovery that Michael was not as financially stable as he had presented himself. The apartment was leased, not owned. The car was on credit. The lifestyle he maintained was funded partly by a business that was beginning to struggle and partly by a complicated arrangement with a woman in another city who Sandra knew nothing about. Sandra found this out on an ordinary Tuesday when a phone call came through Michael's phone while he was in the shower. She did not mean to answer it. She picked it up thinking it was her own phone. The woman on the other end said, "Michael, the money you promised has not arrived. I need it for the children's school fees." Sandra set the phone down on the table very carefully. She sat very still. Then she picked it up again and ended the call before Michael came out of the bathroom. She did not confront him immediately. She sat with the information for days, turning it over quietly, looking at it from different angles the way you examine something you have found on the ground and cannot quite identify. She began paying attention differently to his phone, his schedule, his excuses for late arrivals. She began adding things up. A trip he claimed was for business but for which she found no business evidence. A hotel receipt in a jacket pocket. Long conversations in a closed room in a lowered voice. The picture that assembled itself was not a flattering one. Michael was not a devoted man who had fallen for Sandra. He was a man who collected women the way some people collected shoes, out of habit, out of vanity, because he could. Sandra had been the latest addition to the collection. Nothing more. The final confrontation was ugly. Sandra sat at the kitchen table one evening when Michael came home late and smelling of perfume she did not recognize, and she said simply, "Tell me about the children." Michael's face changed. Just for a second, the tightening around the eyes, a slight pause before his expression rearranged itself into something smooth and controlled. "What children?" he said. "Whose children?" Sandra looked at him. "The ones whose school fees you have not paid," she said quietly. What followed was not dramatic. Michael did not shout or cry or confess emotionally. He looked at her with that cutting calm she had come to dread, and he said, "Sandra, you came into my life with very little. I gave you a great deal. Let's not make this more complicated than it needs to be." Then he walked past her into the bedroom and closed the door. 3 weeks later, Michael told her the apartment lease was not being renewed. He was relocating, he said. For business reasons. He said it with the same ease with which he had once said, "Keep the change." No apology. No conversation. No acknowledgement of the months she had spent in his life or the life she had abandoned to be there. He handed her an envelope with money, enough for 2 months in a budget apartment, and said, "You're a smart woman. You'll be fine." And just like that, it was over. Sandra stood in the middle of that beautiful apartment for the last time, surrounded by furniture that did not belong to her, wearing a dress Michael had bought her, holding an envelope of money she had not earned, and understanding, in that moment, fully and without question, the colossal, irreversible nature of the mistake she had made. Sandra spent 3 months in a state that she could only later describe as walking underwater. She rented a small room in a neighborhood not unlike the one she had come from. She found work as an assistant in a small office, a humbling experience for a woman who had been attending rooftop parties just months earlier. She was quieter than she had ever been. The bravado, the hunger, the restless wanting, all of it had gone still inside her, replaced by something heavy and clear. Regret is a strange teacher. It does not shout. It whispers, persistently, at all hours, usually at 3 in the morning when sleep will not come and the silence is absolute. Sandra lay awake many nights reconstructing her choices, not to torture herself, but because she was trying to understand how a person who had been genuinely loved could have thrown it away so completely for something so hollow. She thought about David constantly. She thought about the way he had knelt at her feet during their hardest days. She thought about the notes he used to leave her. She thought about the evening she had found him ironing his one good shirt in the dark because the electricity was low, and how he had looked up and smiled at her as if the world were just fine. She had not recognized what she had while she had it. She understood this now with a clarity so sharp it was almost physical. One evening, she found a photograph on her phone, one she had forgotten she still had. It was from a neighborhood street party about 2 years into their marriage. She and David were sitting on plastic chairs, sharing a plate of food, laughing at something nobody else could see. They were poor in that photograph. Undeniably, completely poor. And they were so clearly, obviously happy. She made the decision to find him on a Saturday morning. She did not have a plan beyond that. She told herself she was not going to ask for him back, she knew she had no right. She only wanted to look at him, to apologize properly, to say the 3 lines she had never given him but which he deserved: "I was wrong. I am sorry. You were always enough." She found out through old neighbors that David had moved. Tracking him down took 2 weeks of careful asking. Then one morning, she took a bus across the city toward an address someone had given her, not knowing exactly what she would find. What Sandra found stopped her completely at the entrance of a large open hall decorated with flowers, ribbons, and white fabric that caught the afternoon light and made everything glow. People moved around in fine clothes, laughing, taking photographs, arranging chairs and flower arrangements with the busy joy of people preparing for something wonderful. A wedding. Sandra stood at the entrance and could not move. Then she saw him. David was standing at the far end of the hall in a beautifully fitted suit, laughing with Emmanuel and 2 other men she did not recognize. He looked different. Not just in the clothes, in his entire bearing. He stood the way people stand when they are no longer afraid. He looked healthy, confident, and deeply, peacefully happy. Beside him stood a woman in an elegant ivory dress, tall, graceful, looking at David with an expression Sandra recognized with devastating clarity. It was the expression of a woman who knew exactly what she had and was not going to take a single day of it for granted. Sandra stood at that entrance for a long time without moving. Nobody noticed her. She was just a woman standing at the edge of someone else's happiness. She watched David laugh. She watched Adiz reach up and straighten his collar with a gentle, familiar touch. She watched the 2 of them exchange a look, the private, wordless kind that belongs only to people who have truly seen each other. And something inside Sandra finally, fully, and completely broke. Not with anger. Not with bitterness. Just with grief. Pure and honest grief for what she had had, what she had destroyed, and what she would spend a very long time learning to live without. She turned around quietly, the same way she had once walked out of her marriage, except now there was no car waiting, no promise of luxury, no Vivian cheering her on. There was only a bus stop at the end of the road and the long journey back to a small rented room and a life she would have to rebuild from the rubble of her own choices. Inside the hall, David did not know she had been there. He placed his hand on Adi's and smiled at her, and she smiled back, and the flowers smelled sweetly, and the afternoon light was golden, and the music started, and everything was exactly as it should be. He had not forgotten Sandra. He had not forgotten the pain, or the empty apartment, or the 3-line letter. But he had done something with all of it that Sandra had not yet learned to do. He had let it teach him. He had let it pass through him and out the other side. And what remained, after all the grief, all the rejection, all the struggling mornings and silent evenings, was simply David himself. Patient. Honest. Unbroken. Ready. Adis looked at him and whispered, "Are you happy?" David looked at the flowers, at their gathered family and friends, at the life he had built from nothing, and then he looked at her, this woman who had chosen him not for what he had but for who he was, and he said, "I have never been more sure of anything." Outside, a bus arrived at the stop at the end of the road. Sandra stepped on it. The doors closed. The wedding went on. And in the way that the truest stories always end, not with punishment or revenge, but with consequence, each person arrived exactly where their choices had always been quietly leading them. Thank you for watching this story to the end. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe, like, and share it with someone who needs this lesson today. Remember, money may attract people, but character is what keeps relationships strong. We'll see you in the next emotional story.